So, hello and welcome back yet again as we dive back into Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, which I have been really enjoying so far. Like, I I'm never sure what to expect with these, literary classics, these older books. I'm never sure if I'm going to actually relate to them, but I'm I'm finding a decent amount of commonality with with this book, which is weird but actually makes sense because when you think about the age that this was written in, when so much stuff was getting discovered, and then you think about the age that we're in where so much stuff is getting discovered, it seems like a parallel. That could just be me. I don't know. I could be talking out of my big toe, but I don't know. I'm finding commonality. I don't think that means I'm going to try to cobble together a gigantic monster and then run away from it. At least I don't think I'm going to. This would have been a good one to be reading around Halloween, because then I could have transitioned into Frankenstein makeup. Anyway, we're going to jump back in and read another 2 chapters tonight. Yeah, not too long, not too short. These are nice length. So let's just go ahead and jump back into volume 1 of Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, chapter 3. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary, for the completion of my education, that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favorite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended the sick bed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignancy of the distemper. Elizabeth was saved, but the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her preserver. On the 3rd day, my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and happy and beloved as I have been, is it not hard to quit you all? But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she who we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, could have departed forever, that the brightness of a beloved eye could have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear could be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away some dear connection? And why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, though it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest, and learn and think ourselves fortunate, whilst one remains whom the spoiler had not seized. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege so soon to leave the repose, akin to death, of the house of mourning, and rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not the less alarm me. I was unwilling to quit the sight of those who remained to me, and above all, I desired to see my sweet Elizabeth in some degree consoled. She indeed veiled her grief, and strove to act the comforter to us all. She looked steadily on life, and assumed its duties with courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those who she had been taught to call her uncle and cousins. Never was she so enchanting as at this time, when she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us. She even forgot her own regret in her endeavors to help us forget. The day of my departure at length arrived. Clerval spent the last evening with us. He had endeavored to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and to become my fellow student, but all in vain. His father was a narrow-minded trader, and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambitions of his son. Henry deeply felt the misfortune of being barred from a liberal education. He said little, but when he spoke, I read in his kindling eye and his animated glance a restrained but firm resolve not to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, or persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, and we retired under the pretense of seeking repose, each fancying that the other had been deceived. But when at the morning's dawn I descended to the carriage which was to convey me away, they were all there. My father to bless me, Clerval to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties that I should write often, and to bestow the last feminine attention on her playmate and friend. I threw myself into the chaise that was to convey me away, and indulged in the most melancholy reflections. I, who had ever been surrounded by amenable companions, continually engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure, I was now alone. In the university whither I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey, but as I proceeded, my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and I had longed to enter the world and to take my station amongst other human beings. Now, my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length, the high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted and was conducted to my solitary apartment to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps away from my father's door, led me first to M. Krempe, a professor of natural philosophy. He was an uncouth man, but deeply imbued in the secrets of his science. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy. I replied carelessly, and partly in contempt, mentioned the names of my alchemists as the principal authors I had studied. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" I replied in the affirmative. "Every minute," continued M. Kemp with warmth, "every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed, are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew." And so saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating of natural philosophy which he desired me to procure, and he dismissed me after mentioning that in the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy in its general relation, and that M. Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry on alternate days that he omitted. I returned home not disappointed, for I have said that I had long considered those authors useless who the professor reprobated. But I returned, not at all the more inclined to recur to these studies in any way, shape, or form. M. Krempe was a squat little man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not prepossess me in favor of his pursuit. In rather a too philosophical and connected a strain, perhaps, I have given an account of the conclusions that I had come to concerning them in my early years. As a child, I had not been content with the results promised by the modern professors of natural science, with a confusion of ideas only to be accounted for by my extreme youth and my want of a guide in such matters. I had retrod the steps of knowledge along the paths of time and exchanged the discoveries of recent inquiries for the dreams of forgotten alchemists. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of science sought immortality and power. Such views, though futile, were grand, but Now the scene had changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in the science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days of my residence at Ingolstadt, which were chiefly spent in becoming acquainted with the localities and the principal residents in my new abode. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which M. Kemp had given to me concerning the lectures, and although I could not consent to go and hear that little conceited fellow deliver sentences off of a pulpit, I recollected what he had said of M. Waldman, whom I had never seen, as he had hereto been out of town. Partly from my curiosity and partly from idleness, I went to the lecturing room, which M. Waldman entered into shortly after. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture by a recapitulation of the history of chemistry and the various improvements made by different men of learning, producing with fervor the names of the most distinguished of the discoveries. He then took a cursory view of the present state of the science and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few preparatory experiments, he concluded with a pharyngenic upon modern chemistry, the terms of which I shall never forget. The ancient teachers of this science, he said, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem made only to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air that we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. These were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such the words of fate, which were announced to destroy me. As he went on, I felt as if my soul were grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched which form the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much had been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more will I achieve. Treading the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. I closed not my eyes that night. My internal being was in a state of insurrection and turmoil. I felt that order would thence arise, but had no power to produce it. By degrees, after the morning's dawn, sleep came. I awoke, and my yesternight's thoughts were as a dream. There only remained a resolution to return to my ancient studies and devote myself to a science for which I believed myself possessed a natural talent. On the same day, I paid M. Waldman a visit. His manner in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there was a certain dignity in his mien during the lecture, which in his own home was replaced by the greatest affability and kindliness. I gave him pretty much nearly the same account of my former pursuits as I had given his fellow professor. He heard with attention the little narration concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that M. Kemp had exhibited. He said that these were men whose zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundation of their knowledge. They had left to us as an easier task to give new names and arrange in connected classification the facts which they, in great degree, had been the instruments of bringing to light. The labors of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. I listened to this statement, which was delivered without any presumption or affection, and then added that his lecture had removed any prejudice against modern chemists, and I expressed myself in measured terms with the modesty and deference due from a youth to his instructor, without letting escape — the inexperience in life would have made me ashamed — any of the enthusiasm which had simulated my intended labor. I requested his advice concerning the books which I ought to procure. "I am happy," said M. Waldman, "to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is that branch of natural philosophy in which the greatest improvements have been and may be made. It is on that account that I have made it my peculiar study, but at the same time I have not neglected the other branches of science. A man would make but a very sorry chemist if he attended to the department of human knowledge alone. If your wish is to become truly a man of science, and not merely a pretty experimentalist, I should advise you, apply to every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics." He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure, and promising me the use of his own when I should have advanced far enough in the science not to derange their mechanisms. He also gave me the list of books which I had requested, and so I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny. And that is the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works, so full of genius and discrimination, which modern inquirers have written on these subjects. I attended the lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science of the university, and I found even in M. Kemp a great deal of sound sense and real information, combined, true, with a repulsive physiognomy and manner, but no less valuable for that. In M. Waldman, I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged by dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of the pedantry. In 1,000 ways he smoothed for me the path of knowledge and made the most obtuse inquiries clear and easy to my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning whilst I was still engaged in my laboratory. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardor was indeed the astonishment of the students, and my proficiency the astonishment of the masters. Professor Kremp often asked me with a sly smile how Cornelius Agrippa went on, whilst M. Waldman expressed the most heartfelt exultation in my progress. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticement of science. In other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity, which closely pursued one study, must infallibly arrive at great proficiency in that study, and I, who continually sought the attainment of one object of pursuit, and was solely wrapped up in it, improved so rapidly that at the end of 2 years I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point, and had become well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors, my residence there being no longer conducive to my improvement, I then thought of returning to my friends and native town, when an incident happened that protracted my stay. One of the phenomenon which had particularly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life. Whence, I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has ever been considered as a mystery, yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted? If cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries, who knows what we would know? I revolved to those circumstances in my mind, and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy that relate to physiology. Unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to the study would have become irksome, almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have ever feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect on my fancy, and a churchyard was merely to me the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worms. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object, the most insupportable to the delicacy of human feelings. I saw how the fine form of a man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries towards this same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover such an astonishing secret. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens than that which I now affirm to be true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet the stages of discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The astonishment which I had at first experienced on this discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor, to arrive at once at the summit of my desires was the most gratifying consummation of my toils. But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had progressively led to it were obliterated, and I only beheld the results. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. Not that, like a magic scene, it all opened upon me at once. The information I obtained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavors so soon as I should point them towards the object of my search, rather than to exhibit an object already accomplished. I was like the man who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life aided by one glimmering, seemingly ineffectual light. I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes are expressing, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved on that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me. If not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be his whole world. How much happier than he who aspires to become greater than his nature should allow. When I found so astonishing a power placed in my hands, I hesitated a long time concerning the matter in which I should employ it. Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it, with all of its intricacies of fibers and muscles and veins, that still remained the work of inconceivable difficulty and labor. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself or one of a simpler organization, but my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate as to this arduous undertaking, but I doubted not that I should ultimately succeed. I prepared myself for a multitude of reverses. My operations might be incessantly baffled, and at last my work be imperfect, but when I considered the improvement which every day takes place in science and mechanics, I was encouraged to hope that my present attempts would at least lay the foundations to a future success. Nor could I consider the magnitude and complexity of my plan as any argument of its impracticality. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make this being of gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height and proportionally large. After having formed this determination, and having spent some months in successfully collecting and arranging my materials, I began. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death appeared to me to be ideal bounds which I should first break through, and then pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation on lifeless matter, I might, in due process of time, although I now found it impossible, but I might renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes, on the very brink of certainty, I failed, yet still I clung to the hope which the next day or next hour might realize. One secret, which I alone possessed, was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon gazed on my midnight labors while with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble, and my eyes swim with the remembrance, but then a resistless and almost frantic impulse urged me forward, and I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. It was indeed but a passing trance that only made me feel with renewed acuteness so soon the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate. I returned to my old habits. I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. In a solitary chamber, or rather a cell, at the top of the house, and separated from all the other apartments by a gallery and staircase, I kept my workshop of filthy creation, my eyeballs starting to come from their sockets in attending to the details of my employment. The dissecting room and the slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation, while still urged on by eagerness which perpetually increased. I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul in the one pursuit. It was the most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage, but my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature. And the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles away and whom I had not seen for so long a time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remembered the words of my father. I know that well you are pleased with yourself. You will think of us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. You must pardon me if I regard any interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties have been equally neglected. I knew well, therefore, what would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear my thoughts away from my employment, loathsome in and of itself, but which had taken an irresistible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings or affection until the great object which swallowed up every habit of my nature was completed. I then thought that my father would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to vice or faultiness on my part, but I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be free from blame. A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind and never allow passion or transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affection and to destroy your taste for these simple pleasures which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, it does not benefit the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affections, Greece would not have been enslaved. Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru would not have been destroyed. But I forget. I am moralizing during the most interesting part of my tale, and the look on your face reminds me to proceed. My father made no reproach in his letters, and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations more particularly than before. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or expanding leaves, sights which before always yielded to me supreme delight. That is how deep I was engrossed in my occupation. The leaves of that year had withered before my work drew to a close, and now every day showed me more plainly just how well I had succeeded. But my enthusiasm was checked by my anxiety, and I appeared rather like one doomed by slavery to toil in the mines or any other unwholesome trade, rather than an artist occupied by his favorite employment. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree. The fall of a leaf startled me, and I shunned my fellow creatures as if I had been guilty of a crime. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck that I perceived I had become. The energy of my purpose alone sustained me, and my labors would soon end. And I believed that exercise and amusement would then drive away any insipid disease, and I promised myself both of these things once my creation was complete. And that was the end of chapter 4, and I like this book. Oh my gosh, I kind of wish I had read this much sooner. Like, this is not an updated version, and it's written in a way that is very comprehensible. I really am enjoying it. Also, yeah, the more I read, the more I'm like, yes, so many things. The more things change, the more things just kind of stay the same. Because I bet you could find scientists today who probably say a lot of the same things that old Victor there is saying. Anyway, it's been almost an hour. I thought that this was going to be like a 30-minute video, and here we are at 45. So I'm just going to end this by saying I'm really enjoying this, and I hope that you are as well. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out if you don't mind. It's free and, it always makes me smile. If you're not subscribed, you can hit that button too. It is also free. You gotta love that whole free thing. And, that way you will know every time I upload anything. Some of it might even be something you enjoy. I do a lot of different things, and I'd love to have you. Thank you, and I will see you later.